Um, my name is Marge Henn, in case you didn't know. I'm married to that handsome man in the back. We've been here, oh no, the one that's in the blue. And we've been here 11 years. We've been here 11 years. Yeah, I live in the hen house. That's right. And our connection with Otterbein goes way, way back, and you'll find out more about that as we do Otterbein's history next week. By trade, I was an educator, and my training was in history and elementary education, and I had a dual degree of high school and elementary, so, but I liked the elementary kids. They weren't quite so big. And I'm a graduate of Otterbein College, class of 57. All right, this is the story of the Union Village Shakers. Because on this land, all 4,005 acres, which includes land that was all the way to, almost to Green Tree Road, all the way to 63, all the way down to Trader's World and where the prisons are. That was the 4,005 acres that the Shakers actually owned, that they sold. So we're going to go back in time to, let's go here. There we go. It all began with Anne Lee. Now, Anne Lee was a lady from Manchester, England, who was born in about 1736, and she was married to a blacksmith. She had 4 children, and she was extremely unhappy in her marriage, and she lost all 4 children. So that's her life in a nutshell. But she was basically very spiritual. She thought all of these things happened to her for a reason. And so she became a part of a group called Quaker group that had pulled aside from the Quakers. And she became a part of that group. And the people that operated that group were the Wardleys, W-A-R-D-L-E-Y. And they basically stayed in England. But Anne left. She had all kinds of trouble. These Quakers were a different kind of Quaker. They believed in hoo-hoo-hoo and stomping around and praising God right out in the church. And the Church of England didn't like them, and a whole bunch of other folks didn't like them. And they were persecuted in a great amount. Well, she decided to come to America, like a lot of people did, and she brought with her her religion, which was Shakers. It became Shakers because they were shaking Quakers. Get the hint there? Now, what she felt that God had led her to do was to live communally, be celibate, regularly confess your sins, not just once, but every day or every time you sinned, you confessed them, and then to separate yourself from the outside world. And her motto was hands to work and hearts to God. And she felt that men and women were equal, and the dance was very much a part of their religious ceremony. And before she died in 1790 or 86, she had this vision. There will be a great, a revival, and it will take place in southeastern United States, which at that time was Kentucky and that area around there. So she died. So the people that were part of her group, she founded the first Shaker settlement, was called Watervliet. And we have a Watervliet here, but it's Watervliet. And then she went ahead and had this vision. But when she passed, there were two people that took over the reins of running all the Shaker communities, and they moved their headquarters from Watervliet to Lebanon, Mount Lebanon, which is near New Lebanon, which is extremely confusing in everything you read about the Shakers, because authors will either write about the place, the actual name, or they'll write about where the area. So you never knew which one they were talking about. Well, anyway, they had heard about this man by the name of McNamara. And he happened to be a resident of Turtle Creek Township. He owned about 160 acres due east of here, across 741, and his neighbor was Malcolm Worley, and he had the 160 acres going this way. So between the two of them, they had 360 acres up here, on both sides, on that side of 741. So McNamara was a rebel unto himself, and he was a preacher. He got mad at the Presbyterians got mad at him, so he founded his own church, and he called themselves the New Lights. Now, New Lights was like a thing that took over all of the United States that was there, or we weren't United States yet, the colonies and Europe. They were the religious leaders who felt strongly that you were responsible for your own salvation. Not a priest, not a preacher, you did it yourself. So anyway, well, they heard that he was a good preacher, and they heard he had connections. They heard that he could get things done because he was a leader. So he came from a well-educated family and came here to preach. Now, 3 missionaries were sent from that Mount Lebanon group down to Kentucky, hoping to catch up with McNamara. And they were Issachar Bates. They were a young man by the name of John Meacham, and another young man by the name of Benjamin Youngs with an S. And one of the best stories is that you can read if you want to know about any is Issachar, because Issachar is the one that stayed around here. He was a character in and to himself. He was a retired Revolutionary War fifer. He played the fife, and he hated war, but boy, could he swear. He learned a lot of swear words. And so they basically, that was one of his bugs. So anyway, they came down here. When they couldn't find McNamara down there, they came up here to find him in Turtle Creek Township. And the first house they knocked on was not McNamara's, because his was way back there. They knocked on Worley's. And Worley said, "Oh, I'm so glad you came." And that astounded them because, they'd never met this person. But Worley himself was looking for God. He was looking for God to make a presence within him. And he was glad to have them. And so he became converted right away. It took McNamara about a month or 2 before he switched over. And this is his house. It was still here when Otterbein bought the land. And they both converted to Shakerism, and it was in 1805. So therefore, the West began. I can't find my... Doggone it, where are you? There you go. And the first house they lived in was this little... First they lived with McNamara's, and they lived with Worley's. And when all the people from the east came to help them out, they had to get a house, and so they built this little house, which is really logs with clapboard on it, and it was down at the south end, probably behind the 2 little houses that sit on the hill, just behind them. That's where it was. And they were very open, and they grew very quickly because all of McNamara's congregation joined in. And when you came in as a convert, you signed over your land. If you became a convert, you could sign over your land and then become a Shaker and live communally. And you had to agree to the 4 tenets that we talked about before. So during the years of 1806 to 1824, McNamara and Issachar Bates and Benjamin Youngs spent their time trying to get more colonies started. And they all came about. The first one was, of course, us. And the next one they did was Watervliet. And then they did West Union and Pleasant Hill and South. Now, Benjamin Youngs is the one that went down and spent most of his time as a missionary in South Union and Pleasant Hill. McNamara and Issachar stuck around Whitewater and West Union. West Union was that was a really short-lived one because they were really on the frontier, and those guys were just lucky to stay alive. They didn't have time to do much gathering of more people into their Shaker beliefs, and they had a lot of trouble with the Indians. The Indians weren't too swift, but the Indians for McNamara and the people here were very friendly. Didn't have any problem with them. All right, meanwhile, back at Union Village, with all these people coming in, they had to get some jobs and all that sort of thing. So they started out. They built a sawmill. The Shaker School was opened. The community wasn't named Union Village till 1812 because there was another, they wanted to call it Union, but there was another Union someplace in Ohio, and they would, postmaster wouldn't let them do it. And so they put the village on it, so that went through. They introduced merino sheep, and there was a fever that claimed many lives, and they lost quite a few people. But that was all they could do. All right. In 1829, look how it had grown. It had grown into 7 different families. We got the Center family right here, the East family over here, which housed the children, mostly the children, and the laundries. They had a big laundry over there. They had the North house, which was actually located up here. And this house, I'm not sure what that was, whether it was just a house or whether it was Worley's house or what the heck it was. They had a square house, and the square house is kind of down, not at the beginning of the Armco Lake, but kind of just maybe around where the boat dock is, just around that way. And the grist mill is about 45, 50 feet below water and it's just in front of the dam. Okay, so that was there. Then they had a West Brick, which was located about a half a mile from the corner west on the north side of the road. And Bob and I tried to figure that out, and we think it was pretty close to the where the ODOT, there's a small ODOT garage there. Isn't that right, Randy? Yes. Yeah, well, anyway, and then there was the West Frame, which was down here. It's probably where the big prison is, in that general area. And the West family is really in the back. It's below, as you come down to the road, there's a little dip and there's a little gate, and you go back a road, and it's way back in there. The prison owns this whole area right here. And the South family was down there in the corner where, not quite on the corner, but where those 2 little houses were, where the land is up and high. Okay, there was a South family. This was made in 1829 by some unknown Shaker, and he basically did this to show how the land was used. The orchards were light red, the meadows light orange, the pastures certain color, the sugar camps blue, tilling grounds, so forth. he had it done by this. And if you'll notice, all of the buildings are laid down. And there's a reason for that. The East sent a man to keep everything in order. His name is Darrow, and he became the first elder of the village. His name is David Darrow. And he decided to get them organized into orders. It was based on your spiritual progress. The first order was always your leaders, your elders. And you were either an elder which took care of the spiritual part of the Shakers, or you were a trustee that handled the money. Either or. Each family had their own elder and eldress so that you could go confess when you did a sin. They had it right there. The young believers were often called gatherers, and these were people who hadn't decided whether or not they wanted to be a Shaker. And the families would run anywhere from 25 to 120, and they had their own plot of land, and they lived in communal houses with the men either living on one side or one floor and the women on the other. And each family worked together and worshiped together. This is an early map drawn by McNamara, and you can see how he's laid these down. Now, this is what his version of what the north lot looked like. The north lot was where the curve is on Armco, right there at Armco, where the soccer fields are, okay? It had a brother's shop right here. It had the house, which had a tea. It was a tea house. They had a barn. They had a sister's shop. They had several things. And they also had barns across the road over actually in Armco's area. But you see how they're laid down? They're done that. It's done that way so that if you were looking at the map and you were looking at a house, you would know exactly what it looked like, because it had the window pattern and the chimney pattern, and they had all kinds of crafts. These are just some of the things that they made here at Union Village. Chairs, garden seat, Poland China hogs. They crossbred 2 hogs and developed these enormous, huge pigs. And they were sold at market, and they were really good. It was a really good business until somebody back east decided that pork wasn't good for you. So they got rid of all their pigs, and they gave the rights to breed the pigs to someone else. So they did silk production, they made cough syrup and sarsaparilla, and they did baskets and bonnets, and we'll go through some of these because they were very, very busy folk. Bonnets. All right. Bonnets were made of palm leaves, and actually they brought the palm leaves up from the south, and they dried them, and then they would weave them. Well, in 1836, this was tediously done by hand, and in 1836, one of the Union Village Shaker gentlemen invented this thing over here. It's a loom to actually do the weaving of them, so save the sisters. Then you just cut off a hunk and then burn the around and make the bonnet. And sometimes these bonnets were, this little thing down here was keep the sun off the back of your neck, was done to keep you from getting sunburned, for one thing, and the bugs, keep the bugs out. Some of the times they were cotton, and most of the time they were silk. So that leads us to silk. I love this part. Most of the silk manufacturing on the Shaker property was done here and in Pleasant Hill and down at South Union. And what they did, because we had a lot of mulberry trees, they used mulberry and they used Osage orange. But what they do is they get the moth that lays the eggs, and they collect the eggs, they put them in a little bag, they tuck them down here, the sisters would. until the eggs hatched. And once the eggs hatched in this little bag, they'd take them out and they'd put them in a big box that had all of the leaves of the trees, and those little boogers would just eat that, and then they'd spin a cocoon. Once they spin the cocoon, they'd pull those cocoons off, and they'd kill them. And then they'd very carefully pull all those silk threads off. Very tedious work. Extremely. And when it was time to wind the silk, that thread, you'd have to get a magnifying glass out to look at the thread. Anyway, Abner Beadle came in again, and he developed a winder or a reel to pull that off on and put it on so that they wouldn't have to very carefully do it. Somebody told me that what it takes to throw the silk, it took, I want to say some 25 threads to make just one strand of silk thread. 25 of those little boogers. So anyway, they also made brooms. We had a big broom factory here, and they had boxes. Every single Shaker community across the United States made boxes. They all did. And blue was their favorite color. They were not anything like the Amish that wanted everything plain. Shakers liked color. They really did. And one of their earliest industries here was pottery. And we didn't really discover that until the 2005 dig, how extensive their pottery was. The first kiln was on the West Brick, and the first thing they did, they made pipes. And you can come up and look at this later. This is a pipe bowl. And this thing over here is a blob of pipes that didn't make it through the kiln, through the firing. But they made these at the north here, at the West Brick, and then again at the North Farm. And then in 1840, somebody said, it's not good to smoke. And they sold these. They sold these by box loads full. So they quit making them altogether. They made a few for sale, but most of the time they just kind of phased out of that industry, which was kind of sad. Oh, there it is. Now, the pottery is interesting because there was, they started making other things like bowls that would be, you could put sugar in, utilitarian pottery type stuff. Cookie jars, only I don't think they had cookies in them. But you know what I'm talking, sugar bins. They had a guy, but their director in charge was Nathan Sharp. Well, now Nathan was not the best elder in the world, or trustee. And then you notice in 39, they had a different guy in charge. Well, here's what happened. In 1835, there was a humongous flood. They lost the grist mill, they lost the Square family, they had to rebuild all that stuff. And also, this Mr. Sharp absconded with a horse and $10,000, and he marched himself right into Lebanon and says, I am no longer a Shaker. And 2 days later, wouldn't you know, a little lady by the name Mrs. Morrell went in there, Miss Morrell, and they got married. And to make matters worse, they decided to set up housekeeping in the corner at the corner of 741 and Green Tree, in the Green Tree Inn. They really thumbed their nose. Here's a shot of the broom factory that they had at the North family. It started out as the brothers' shop, and they were doing something on the first floor, and when they lost the big pottery shop on the West Brick, they put another floor in there, and the kilns then were out behind. And some of the archaeologists have found they thought was a kiln, but This one was actually found at the North family lot. The other one we have two of these. The other one was actually found in Marble Hall. One of the remodelers in 1987 put his hand up on the wall of the basement, and he felt something, and he pulled it down, and it was a pipe. The brooms, this is called the carding factory. Now, the carding factory is where they had big looms, and they carded wool, and they made rugs. They made a whole bunch of rugs. And they really had a good business up till the Civil War doing that. And they made their own carpets for their own places, too, their own homes. This is interesting because in 1933, 34, when we had the big Great Depression, Delano Roosevelt sent out unemployed architects to make drawings of historical buildings, and they chose this one. And I retrieved those off of the Library of Congress library site, and we've got all the drawings that they did. And they did several around here, so I thought that was really cool. Those were at the North Lawn. They had a barrel factory and stuff like that down at the grist mill. And we do have a large stone from the grist mill family, and I think Warren McMichael is probably a person I would thank for that, because it used to sit out here in front of the door, on the side of the door. And when they did some remodeling and something, they tore the darn thing up. And I said, don't you dare lose that. And we didn't know what happened to it. And then when Ruth and I were running around helping to find out what was left over there before they tore all those buildings down, we found it. It's over by the White Barn, and it's upside down, but it's still there, so we still have it. Now, the drug industry. This is one of their biggies. Oh, mercy. They were into it. They were what I call the Pfizers of the drug industry. They were the wholesalers, okay? And then they sold them through other people. And one of them is this Mr. Graham, and Mr. Graham was so pleased to sell the shaker stuff. He wrote a nice little pamphlet that he'd give to you, saying how wonderful the shakers were, how clean they were, how pure they were, how everything they did was perfect. And that's what that one. And then they had a catalog page. Now here is the catalog, a reproduction of the catalog of 1850 that they would sell. Like milkweed root would sell for 35 cents a pound. And they put them in pound blocks, or they would chop them up. But the shakers had their own very good drug industry. And just recently, thanks to a wonderful benefactor, we acquired an actual bottle of shaker cough syrup. Now, shaker cough syrup was, or this is pain cure, excuse me. We also, and it's marked on the side, Union Village, Ohio, and then shaker cough syrup. It was marketed by a man called Dr. Turner, but he got the wholesale product from one of the Slingerland, who was the trustee at the time. And now this was as late as the 1890s. So you see, that drug industry went from about 35, 40 all the way up to the 90s. They were selling these drugs. They were good for rose water and all that kind of stuff. Another thing they did, they made wine. And you say, wow, I didn't think those shakers drunk anything. Well, they did. They had medicinal alcohol occasionally, but it was usually made from fruit. Well, Slingerland, who was the last trustee before they sold it to Otterbein, must have thought of himself as a Carnegie Mellon or John D. Rockefeller, but he was trying to branch out and make more money for the shakers. And so he bought a winery. He bought a bunch of grape land and winery stuff up in North Union. And that's where, and he sent his buddy, Mr. Ayers, up there to do it, to run the winery. And it didn't last long. Maybe 3 years. They lost a lot of grapes due to weather and so forth. And here's some of the buildings that were left by the Shakers. Now, this was the North family lot, and it was built in 1823. And Otterbein kept it around till about 1863. And they used it, they remodeled it and used it. It burned in, in the mid-century there sometime. It burned in the 60s. 1860s, it was gutted, but then they rebuilt it. The Shakers rebuilt it. Malampy, Clarence Malampy, who is the grandfather or father of our Mr. Malampy, actually lived there. He was one of the Shakers' tenant farmers. This was the meeting house, and the meeting house was used by Otterbein also, and it stood directly across the street from Marble Hall. You could walk from the front door of Marble right to the meeting house. And you see it had 2 doors, one for the men and one for the women, and there were occasionally trustees that lived above it. It was an entirely timber house, and it was made in 1818, and Otterbein used it for practice, fireman's practice, and it took them a long time to get it down because those beams are really big. And the floor was especially heavy because of all the dancing. They had a lot of dancing that went on. This is the center house that was here. Now, the center house, if you went across the street from the current LEC, straight across, there's a parking lot there. And that's where the center house was. Right, Randy? When Randy came, that was still here. No.
I visited here.
You visited here then. Oh, excuse me. I'll pull that sucker out. It again, Otterbein used it. Their first use was older people. That's where they put the old people. Because otherwise, the other place was full of kids, and they didn't want anything to do with those. They were full of it. Anyway, right where the terrace place was another building called the Old Shaker Post Office. It was called the office. Otterbein called it Rose Cottage. It was the missionary house. It was all kinds of things. And it was around till about 1982. And they tried to save that. It was the original place where the trustees of these businesses held business. It was their original office. Now, this is the building you wanted to know about. This is the building right here. It was used by Otterbein. That was called we called it Bethany. They called it the Center Brick, and it was built. It was the last Shaker building they built. It was built in 1844. Actually, it took them 40 years to about 46. I think they finally finished it. And it had a marker way at the top, and we have that over at the museum. But it was built with 1 million bricks. 1 million bricks that were done right here on site. And actually, their population was going down at that time, but the people out east said, you need another building. So they built it. And the only accident was one of the guys that was working up in here fell and died. That was it. But you notice, look, we got 2 water towers there. Water was always interesting around here. Sunbeam Cottage was a building that they hauled from the south farm up here, and they used it to house girls. It was just a timber and frame house, but they remodeled it and used it to house the little girls. The Shaker School. And the last teacher that we used it was, Shaker's teacher was Oliver Hampton, and he was a wonderful man. He came in 1822 when he was a child, and he got to grow up here as a Shaker. His parents were here. His sister stayed. I think his brother died early, but he became the Shaker. He was so good. He was accepted all through Lebanon. He was on the Warren County Board of Education, and he would lead song fests because he was a prolific writer and he was a good singer. And he went to, unfortunately died in 1900, and I'll tell you that story in a minute. The other one, West Frame, Otterbein actually used that one too. They used it to house all the single women that worked here. I don't know what the men did, but... And the West Frame barns that were here, and the West Brick. So those are the ones that were left when Otterbein bought the property. And of course, Marble Hall. Built in 1810, it originally looked just like this. And then in 1890 to 93, it made the transformation to that. Isn't that something? Also in 1892, another building was built. It was this one. It was the train station. Now, if you go down 63, and just before you get to the first set of tracks, it probably was right there on the south side. They said it was the most beautiful train station they'd ever seen. Now, the last leader. This guy was a piece of work. His name is Joseph Slingerland. He was supposedly a doctor, but nobody could find credentials. Most of these guys that claimed to be doctors were really homeopathic people who like to use herbs and drugs to cure everything. Anyway, he was commissioned by the people in the East to straighten that place up and get more people in. So he thought if he spent all the money they had, they could do it. Well, he got them in all kinds of debt, and he made some of the most stupid business adventures you'd ever want to know. And I'm thinking this picture was taken either in room 102, apartment 102, or 101, because the turret is there. So this was taken after he remodeled that. He also decided we need to start a Shaker settlement in warmer countries so that all of our infirmed Shakers can go down there and stay warm during the winter. So they bought this big plantation down in Georgia in Camden County, and it had more marble in it than Marble Hall had. It had marble everywhere. It had marble sinks. It had marble countertops. It had marble sills. It had 10 marble tables in their dining room, but I don't think they were ever filled. Anyway, he lost a lot of money on the deals, and in 1902, the East said, well, you're done. You're out of here. So they asked another gentleman to come in and take over, who was actually living here, to take over and see if he could untangle all the mess that Slingerland had gotten them into. And his name was James Fennessy. He was a delightful man, and he actually lived here. They had now let's do a quick summary here. The Union Village had elders that were in charge of every village, the big wigs. And then underneath them, each family had a set. And then each family had a trustee at that level. So you had two levels. The population grew from 370 in the first year to 634 in 1818. And then it grew down to about 448 in 1850. I found out that one of the groups that came here, I I couldn't figure out when I was doing my research was what was this Day Star. The Day Star was a paper that was published here, and it was published by a group leader for the Millerites. Now, anybody know about the Millerites? They were a group of people in the 1830s or 20s and 30s who Mr. Miller had a vision and said the world will come to an end at such and such a time at such and such a place. And so all these people believed him and became followers, and they were all set to go. They sold everything, and they got there, and the world didn't come to an end, and Jesus didn't come again. Right there. And so they were all kind of disgruntled. And some went here and formed a group called the Adventists and another group called something else. Well, one of the groups came here, about 200, and they settled not only here, but they settled in Whitewater, they settled in Pleasant Hill, and they were in this area, Watervliet. And they only stayed a couple years. Some of them that did stay, maybe 50, joined the ranks of the Shakers. So by the time Dr. Philippi got here in 1909, there were only 28 Shakers left. Most of the Shakers died off. And as they closed, all of those, I didn't put a map in there of all the other colonies, but of the other colonies, the one on the front, or this one here. The one that looks like this little one. As they closed, the people would move in to Union Village. They would all wind up down here. When they sold the North family to get out of debt from Slingerland, they closed Watervliet, they mortgaged Watervliet, and then they closed it. And, of course, West Union was already closed. Pleasant Hill and South Union kind of went their way and melded into the world. And the only one left was Whitewater and this one. And Whitewater then hung around a little bit longer, but then they really didn't do much. They didn't really practice that anymore. All right, the total membership. The name Union Village was given a spiritual name in 1942. It became known as Wisdom's Paradise. And if you want to read a good book, read this one. This one was written by Cheryl Bauer and Senator Rob Portman. And it was based on Rob Portman's high school theme, or a paper that he wrote for high school. And he was very kind to Mary Lou Warner and gave her a copy of that. So we actually have a copy of his thing. But he and Cheryl got together and did the story of Union Village, and they called it Wisdom's Paradise because that was its spiritual name. That's a very good book. Okay. In the last years, this is one of my favorite pictures. I like the story about people. This guy right here. He was named Leopold Gepper, and I did a story about him for the Echoes. Leopold came as an actually older gentleman in the 70s or 80s to here, 1870, 1880, because he was looking for God. He was sort of a doctor. He was a father of, 11 kids. His wife was supposed to come with him. She said, no way. And so he said, okay, you can have everything, and he just came. So he stayed here till he died. So after they got through all of this Slingerland mess in the early 1900s, they had a little money in their coffers. And so the people here decided, we're going to spend it on ourselves. So they went out and they bought 2 of these things. 2 of these touring cars. $5,000 a piece. And and East got a little upset and says, "How dare you do that?" And he wrote, says, "It's our money. If I want to buy a Wright Brothers plane, I'll buy a Wright Brothers plane." Because the Wright brothers had just flown, and they were beginning to sell cars. This is about 1910, I think, 10 or 11. And I know this is a fact because it was in a newspaper article. The last Shakers that lived here were these people. This girl, and I think this girl were all here to take care of 1, 2, 3 guys. This Moore Mason, I couldn't find anything about him here too much, but then as I read further, I found out that Moore was, when they closed Watervliet, he came here along with Clamenia Minor, I think is how you say her name. Anyway, they came here from Watervliet that was closed. And Watervliet, I know some of you know where Watervliet is in Dayton. It was on the end of Patterson Road in East Dayton. We call it East Dayton. Anyway, this was taken in probably the same room that Slingerland's picture was taken, only turned around. Because if you really look carefully, right here is the staircase in Marble Hall. And that's a fireplace. We don't have any there anymore. All right, this is the kitchen. And again, this is when you come in Marble Hall, this is what you see. You see the floor, and we've got a couple buildings. We've got a desk here, but this is what they used it for. The sink was over here in this corner, and then they had 2 of these neat stoves, and they were cooking there, and they used the cupboards as pass-throughs because the 2 lower rooms there in Marble Hall, one's the men's dining room and the other's the ladies' dining room. So you got to come see that. All right. So the Shakers were gone in 1912. They had a deal with Otterbein. They could stay here till 1922. And they would live in Marble Hall, which was fine. But they all kind of just died out, and the only one left was Mr. Fennessy. And Mr. Fennessy was so enthralled with the children that were here and so enthralled with Otterbein's mission that he set up a scholarship at Otterbein College so that any orphan that wanted to go to college could go to college at Otterbein. I thought that was kind of neat. All right. There wasn't much done about the Shakers here after Otterbein got it. They really didn't do a whole lot about it, their history, except put it in their annuals occasionally. But in 2005, the state decided this almost 90-degree turn here on 741 had to go. I guess there'd been a lot of wrecks up there. So they decided to relocate it, and they were going to cut right through here. Right through there. Well, by this time, the new laws say you can't do that unless you do an archaeological dig. You can't go over a former place where people lived with any project, so they had to do a dig. And this is some of the pictures from the dig. They decided to take it out. And so they really were going through the North family lot. And there's a cistern. Otterbein had already blown up the building. I mean, the building itself was gone. These were all underneath the dirt. And Warren McMichael told me, he said, we got as much as we could, and he said we couldn't get those darn fireplaces down. And he said we used 10 sticks of dynamite. And he said that chimney just went like that. Anyway, they finally got it down. They sold the bricks for that. That was their typical dig. And if you look now at where the Otterbein land it was, you can see where it is now. Now, Shaker Run is called Dix Creek or Shaker Run. It's either or. And that's the one that they dammed up to make Armco Lake. So you can get a little idea of where things are. Now, the earliest aerial view we had of Otterbein was in late 1820s, 1920s. It was done by Bishop Showers had it done. And you can see this is their dairy that they had. And this is a schoolhouse. This is Philippi. And this is the center brick, or the 1844 building. This is Marble Hall. And that one is the elder shop. And these others back here were just barns and things. I've got some more of those. Now, the only thing we have left are these two things of the Shakers. Marble Hall and our little sign. Now, the people who are making the new village have promised they will save this and put it somewhere in the design. And of course, they're saving Marble Hall. Now, I got questions for you if you want for questions. But one thing I want to tell you before we get started. That is not Shaker. Never was. It was always designed as an inn. It was built by Ichabod Corwin. Not Crane. Ichabod Corwin. That's a good one. And he was the same guy that built the Golden Lamb. And this was on a stagecoach route. Actually, 741 was a good route to come up from Cincinnati. Also, Route 4, it's over in Middletown. And this is Green Tree is a connector to Route 4. An old connector to Route 4. So that gives you some idea. And so this thing never was. Its own, it was it was kept as a private home after they decided it wasn't an inn anymore. And in 22, then they had families live in it. Then somebody bought it in 69 and redid it all. And they restored it. And it was beautiful. And then they got a divorce. I guess you don't do that kind of thing unless you have a strong marriage. Anyway, they had an antique store there at one time. And finally, it's in the hands of the Sykes family, Sykes, and he wants to sell it, and I'm not sure what will happen. It's only got about 21 acres, because previously that other land had been sold to the Shakers as part of their North family. So now do we have any questions? Yeah.
Why palm leaves for the bonnets instead of fabric?
Because it was airier, because they wore them in the heat. It was airier. They had silk ones, but the silk was really hard to deal with, and only the rich could afford those. Any other questions? Yeah.
You talked about the marble. I'm not going to say anything else. I just began to wonder when you talked about the marble. We used to have those marble tables in the marble room.
They're still there.
What did they come from? I just had.
They were the dining room tables in Marble Hall. They were. Well, they just brought them over here to use them in the marble room. They didn't use them over there. The marble came from Italy. Mm-hmm. Yeah. The acreage, it really didn't take that long. They had about 4,000 acres really early because a lot of McNamar's people gave it to them, yeah. When they got so old that they couldn't take care of themselves, all of that, they divided the land up into farms. So when Otterbein bought it, they actually bought 7 farms. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm Pat Eschbach. I lived here from 1962 to 66. And at that time, we had 3 marble tables in Marble Hall.
Yeah. One.
And then one disappeared one day or one night. And so we were left with 2. So that's, I think that had a lot to do with it being moved to the center.
Yeah.
I
So-
really do.
Yeah.
And I used to cook in that kitchen in 1962 to 66.
Yeah.
And Warren McMichael said, Pat, were you there when the stove fell down in the basement? And I said, not on my watch.
Well, it fell in the basement because there was, I think, termites.
Yes, we had a lot of termites. That's why Bethany.
Oh, Georgia, he just picked that land because he thought it would be warm. And the other colonies that had were in, there was one in Florida, and there was one there. I have a list up here of all the different Shaker communities, and there was a whole bunch. But actually, believe it or not, Union Village had more than any of them. And we had over 4,000 people that lived here at one time or another. And it gives you a little bit. They had one in Narragansett, Florida. They had one. They had one in White Oak, Georgia. And I just love this research because you always find connections. So I'm looking through this book here. I got it 5 minutes. Anyway, this book here, and I'm going through it, and I looked in here, and I see Berrien Springs, Michigan. These were other Shaker communities, and this book was written by Martha Boyce and Dale Covington and Richard Spence. And I thought, holy cow, that's my backyard, because I'm from Michigan. And I went in there, and the more I read, I found out some of the land that they traded up in there was a couple houses down on our town, right on the corner. I knew exactly where those were. Of course, they're not there now, but anyway, these are some of the minor ones. Other things we have, if you want to know about McNamara, who's really cool, you should read Richard the Shaker. That's a good book. It was written by Hazel Spencer Phillips, who was the first champion of the Shakers in Warren County. Wouldn't you say? Would you say? Yeah. And Cheryl Baker has written another one without Rob Portman this time on the Shakers of Union Village. And she's got some good pictures. She's got some pictures also of early Otterbein. One of our former enthusiasts for the Shakers was Sue Frary. And Sue Frary gave us her entire collection of her research. And bless her heart, she was very thorough. She has gone through and copied every single newspaper article on the Shakers and documented where it was come, and then made a list of the Shakers that were here on that date. We have 4 volumes of it? I just couldn't believe the time she's put in on this. That's part of her collection. We have, there was a group here called the Western Shaker Study Group. Got it right? And they had a big tour here, and this was their little handout that they had. Are they still working on that now? No. When Mr. Rich Spence came over about a month ago, I think he said that they're only working on developing and saving Whitewater, which is nice because it's in a park. It's in a park. And so they've got some buildings, but they haven't done much. One of the early things that you can see is when Mr. Philippi, Dr. Philippi, came here to visit the Shakers in 1909, he wrote a book, or a paper for the telescope, and it tells his impression of the Shakers. And from this is next week's. Yeah.
Mark? The one that the
Yeah. Yeah, it is. Because it's hard to keep these up. Most of them were started with private funds and that sort of thing, but not as a Kentucky State Park. And if you ever wanted to know the name of any Shaker that lived here, we got a book. And I don't know who put these together, two ladies, I guess. What was their name? Ellen Van Houten and Florence Cole. They found every Shaker that ever lived here.
They didn't want to have to give land.
No. A lot of kids were indentured here. You say, well, why did they have kids if they were celibate? Well, they came in as families, but they also collected kids over the years through indenturing. Yeah.
Yeah, some of those old buildings that were very elegant looking, why'd they tear them down?
You'll have to ask Otterbein that.
Wow.
Most of the time, they were extremely in poor shape. You know, marble halls being held together by some good old iron beams and a few, what do you call those things that you put in the basement to lift up jacks? Those kind of things. But because that's all wood, that is not brick. That is a wood building. Yeah.
Those of you who have been around here for a while will remember there was great controversy over taking down
The 1844 building.
1844. But my understanding was a lot of the wood support beams that were laid in the brick were starting to rot out pretty badly. And I think that was the ultimate decision to tear down the building. Randy's nodding his head yes on that one. Yeah.
And there was, in my role as archivist, she declared only 10% of the building was original. That means the inside had been torn in and out so many times. And of that 10%, 90% of it were the bricks. So the bricks went to white water, many of them, and many of them were used to construct the base of the path we have from here to Armco Park. So there was good reason why the buildings came down.
Yeah, they were it's too expensive sometimes
Yeah.
to save a building. So you save either memories or you save pieces of it. And we got some pieces. We do have some pieces.
Marge?
Yeah.
With so many brick buildings, did they make their own brick?
They
And if
made
so,
all their own
where?
brick except
Where at?
at West Brick and up here at the North Farm. That's what the kids did in the summer. They only went to school 3 months. The boys went from December to March, and the girls went from March to some other time, and then that was it, and they had to do something with those kids, so they made bricks. And they sold them, too. Uh-huh. Yeah. Any other, you can come up and look at anything. Just don't run off with my artifacts. It's too hard to put 100 years of really interesting stuff down into an hour, but that was very interesting. Thank you.
The number that I think I heard was $5 million to rebuild.
Oh yeah, it was
a
tremendous.
number like that,
Yeah.
which was insane to rebuild.
Yeah.
It was only 90.